Thanks, honey. So the easiest way to do that would be to do it on the forecourt to start with.
Yeah.
You'll find out that a lot of famous players, Eric Clapton, pretty much anyone that you see doing like a blues jam, they'll be doing major for the first chord. So just for that duration of the four chord, you might hit that minor pentatonic. That's not the only place it can be used. And you actually can do more what you're looking at, which is trying to blend them all the time.
Yeah.
Depending on how, look, for you, I would hazard a guess that some of the reasons why it might be difficult for you is because it's highlighting a sharp 9. So if we have this chord, yeah, right? And you have like, you've been the only student from this term. It's not that uncommon. It's surprising that you're the only one who's been like, it's been really hard for me to identify triads if the root note's not present or if the root note's somewhere else. So it could be something like that, that the sound you need to kind of get used to is sharp 9.
Yeah.
The Hendrix chord. Right? But other ways of doing that. If you take a look at someone like Chuck Berry, he kind of blends the two as a rung. Right? You know, as a kind of a dumpier version of the kind of things he does. So if you think of box 2 pentatonic and box 1 pentatonic of those strings, he would blend.
Yeah.
It's quite likely that if you're playing in a blues, you're going to want to resolve in major. Especially if you feel really connected to that kind of major sound. I wonder if a real quick backing track that's going to.
Because like I normally just sort of stick at the bottom. I don't really like know what to do. Like I suppose it's just really doing the same thing, just a bit like.
Well, one of the things that I would look at is some standard resolve. So like in blues, you'll hear all the time this third tonic.
Yeah.
And even lower. Let's do the right key out. Oh, we'll get it there. See what
Yeah.
And it just for doing it off this version. You will find that after you get used to hearing that sound, you'll hear it all the time as a way of resolving your lines. It is definitely a blues and jazz cliche. Yeah, and you want to transfer that around the neck, right? Like you want to figure out where it is up the top of your box, in the middle of your box, and down the bottom of your box, just in case, depending on where you end up. There'd also be other fingerings, like I said,
Yeah.
And I mean, to be honest, I almost never use this one, but every now and then my fingers are in this position, so I got to.
Yeah.
Which is why it's worth kind of dabbling in some of these other resolutions at times. It also fits into any sliding sixth lick from a blues. So, I'm sure you've heard this before. So that's a sliding sixth lick coming down from the 3 chord. Well, I mean, you could also view it as descending diminished order. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it fits in with a lot of that. So if you do some country kind of stuff. All of those kind of stuff, those things are things that are nice to lean on for things that pop a string. So learning some of these cliches is not a bad way of spending your time. Other ones are like your turnaround cliches, like then when you think about those lines, right? So that's 1, 1, 7, 4, 4 minor, 1 up to 5. Sometimes that will inform your playing. That kind of thing, right? Or you might, the John Mayer might be like in the bass, well, in the lower strings.
Yeah.
So those kind of things are really great for pointing your ear towards certain answers. On specifically how do you use major and minor, let's just see. So this backing track is apparently, I haven't heard it yet, but it's apparently in C7 or C. Oh, I hate this dude. I hate anybody who starts a backing track with their own jam. There's a lot of like just mixing in there. Major. Up. I think you kind of get some of the ideas, right? Like, you can't just blend them constantly, provided that the way out of your line makes sense. This is partially what I've been trying to hit home a lot with this year's worth of work. Is it's about hearing the resolve, and you can kind of make virtually anything provided that it comes out nicely. An awareness of where things feel spicy. On this one. That's pretty spicy. Like, we come from the minor third up to the 4, and the 4 is quite a that's a spicy kind of sound. And then on the way down, that minor third again, quite spicy. It's a sharp 9. So what you've really got to kind of the overall picture is you develop an awareness of where spicy starts feeling that way, and then how to get yourself out of it. All of it will work. There's nothing wrong with using something that's very dissonant. The problem is if it comes as a surprise to you, it's very hard for you to make that feel like it was intentional, and then it sounds like a mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the easiest way of getting going with it would be to think about them as extensions on chords, and to think, well, I mean, if you want to plan it all out, the easiest way to get going is just sit down in front of a backing track for the next 12 hours and just like keep playing until you find things you like. I'm not sure how much easier that is, but that's certainly how I did it when I started out. But you want to think of them like, okay, so on this one chord, the major box is going to go a 6. The 7 is not going to sound bad. Not only that, but if you bend the 7 up, so like, I don't know if we talked about this, but there's some standard bends in the box. In box 1, it's right. Those 3 at the top of box 1 are the standard bends. Pretty much every solo is going to feature those bends at some point. In box 2, it's this one and this one, with a more appropriate finger. See how you feel about bending with your first finger, especially if you're going to do most of your work on on a steel string acoustic, I find if I bend a lot with my first finger, I start peeling out the skin underneath my fingernail.
Yeah.
Which can lead to lots of pain and bleeding. So I've tended to get used to, if I'm going to jump back to where my first finger would bend, I'd jump back with one and two and push both. And I find that saves my bacon a little bit. Even so, my ring finger will sometimes happen if I'm really, really pushing around a lot with the ring finger. It'll peel out from under. So bear that in mind. Bit of safety advice. You can get through a gig if you then get a really thin piece of tape and bind your finger after it's happened, but it's still not comfortable, and you get that weird, slightly numb feeling in your finger. Yeah,
because I normally play on an acoustic, but because I find that because my electric guitars, they're usually always in cases, but my acoustic is always out. So when I see the acoustic, you just want to play it. Whereas if it's in a case, you're more inclined to play something that's already like on a stand. That's just what I find. Like
no, it's not just you. I have a speech I give to all students about how, like, if you don't have an expensive guitar, leave it out next to you. Put it on the damn couch, because if it's out, you'll play it. I had exactly the same scenario. Like, I think I had, when I was a teenager, I don't know, 6 or 7 guitars and cases in my room, and a crappy $80 Yamaha, well, it was a $100 Yamaha nylon string. Man, that nylon string got a lot of action. I just keep picking up when I'm in the middle of doing something else, and pick it up and play it. And I got a lot of practice done because there was a guitar that was out. And if I knew I was going to settle in for a session, there was going to be more than something that I might drag out of case. But just that barrier of having something in a case adds this extra headache, which is surprisingly large, to getting me to practice.
Yeah.
And it's just so easy. It's like, oh, it's in the case. I'll go do this now instead. So no, you're not alone. And I totally get that. If you do start having problems like that, you might want to restring the acoustic with lighted gauge.
Yeah.
Only if you might not be, you might be one of those people that can really develop that kind of tenacity with your nail bed that I've never been able to. And hell, maybe you'll be like my dad. I always develop kind of like soft leather calluses, so mine never really go hard. He's got like plastic. So jealous. It's just hard when he's in playing condition. I'm like, the strings must just like leap out of the way for you.
Yeah, because they don't really go. They've never actually like sort of gone hard. They're a bit like softer. But even when I'm just playing on steel string acoustic, it still doesn't. It's only when it sort of goes up to bends on the sort of lower strings, or like sort of on the G. That's when it sort of starts to.
The G's
a bit. Yeah.
I don't get pain in my fingers. I mean, I will get pain in my fingers eventually. Like I said, bending in the wrong way, bending on really heavy gauge strings. So like on an acoustic, I play on 11s. I can fully acknowledge I've wussed out on this one. I spent years getting to 12s because that's the gauge everyone's supposed to play at, and my hands just would never adapt to it. And while they weren't adapting, I was always the person who got thrown a solo, and I'm like, but it's so much hard work on these top 3 strings, and it's killing my hands. Oh well. And the funny thing about an 11 gauge strings is the A and D are the same gauge on 12s and 11s. It's only the top 3 and the low E. And I kind of wish I could get 11 to 56. Like, I'd be totally happy for the bass strings to be as chunky as they are on 12.
Yeah.
So that top 3 I would like a little lighter. Anyway, okay, so primarily we're looking for getting used to the kind of the funky sound. So one thing that you might want to do is, say, get a loop of just like a C7 chord. And get used to that. Like, so have you done that? Like, where you're just kind of playing the minor against, and how does that work for you?
It's okay when I'm playing just one or the other, but putting them together, I don't know, it may not sound wrong, but it sort of sounds wrong to me, like putting them together, because I just don't know why. Like, because I've been trying to get into more like listening to more like sort of jazz and stuff, and more with more chromaticism, but I don't know, it's just a lot harder to sort of play it than
I would always say baby steps, like, going in through blues, going in through this major minor split. That's definitely a nice little doorway into the start of the jazz world. The jazz world, it's not the licks. It's honestly not the licks. that make jazz jazz. It's the approach to harmony and the approach to how they hear all of these different colors of this chord. Like when you hear this chord, right? That's like a half. That's like, you know, it's a pie with no flavoring in it or something. Like, now, what do you want to flavor it with? Do you want to flavor it with some kind of sus4? So do I get a? Do you want to do it as like flat 9? So we get right. It's really spicy kind of stuff. And in jazz, it's about how you highlight those intervals in your playing. So even really simple stuff can sound extremely jazzy by getting more connected in with the harmonic nature of chords, or even the potential harmonic nature of chords. You know, someone might be going, and you like, so over that, I turned the one chord stayed pretty vanilla, but a little bit of a major seventh on it. But as soon as we hit this chord, I turned it into a dominant flat 9 into the D minor, because I'm kind of treating it as the 5 of D, and whenever anything's the 5, you can get that sharpened, that flat 9 interval. When you're heading towards a minor 1. And on that 5 chord, instead of doing it as a plain, I broke the key signature and turned it into augmented, because I knew that once I do this, even though it's wrong for the key, once I go back to C, it's going to resolve out perfectly, and that tension is going to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Which again, focusing in on resolve, focusing in on creating tension, and that's really like I think that's the real gateway to jazz. I spent years, I did Django Reinhardt's Nuage, my HSC. I did a bunch of, I've transcribed Whole Joe Pass solo stuff for students and been able to play them. And it never really came out in my playing. You know, not in any way that I found satisfying. Not until I started studying, like, not until I had the idea that actually that wasn't the problem. The problem was that it wasn't my chops, it wasn't my licks. It's just that I didn't hear this stuff in my head. And if I can't hear it in my head, then I'm not going to play it.
Yeah.
So this challenge is for you to try to find a way into these sounds. So for you, it sounds like you've got a pretty strong, like, diatonic sense of harmony.
Yeah.
So learning to play with the flavor of some of those things is probably where you're at. And in that sense, doing your blues stuff is really is not a bad gateway into it. What I would say is that you could view it as the minor is more tense and the major is kind of sweeter. So anytime where you do a run where you go from the sweet major into minor and sit in minor, it's likely going to feel uncomfortable for you. So you might want to say, start with a little phrase on major, like say the splitting major minor third, come up in minor, and then come back into major again, right? Because it'll have this bit that will make it sound kind of out and then come back in. I have a similar problem in that, you know, I still can't get into outside playing. You know, like a lot of the time, well, it's not true. When certain players do it, I can really get behind it. But again, it's that they hear those notes. Whenever I get lessons, you know, when you hear lessons online, you're looking like the New York City Jazz School or whatever, and they start doing demonstrations of, here's what outside playing is like. It's like, yep, sounds like you're playing in the wrong key. Like, it sounds like you just sound wrong. And I can't bridge that gap between turning into something that I think sounds cool. I know that on the current path I'm on, I'm going to get there eventually, because what you end up doing is hearing a lot more harmonic potential, hearing how you could say walk between two different ideas, or use things that are outside the key in order to then make a change more interesting. I mean, one of the things that I've given to people before is like, this guy is kind of objectively horrible sounding chord, but if I resolve him out to, it doesn't sound so bad anymore. Like a lot of those notes are isolated to the other thing, which makes it acceptable. And that's kind of the basic idea, is that whenever I do something, it's got to have a natural flow on the way out. The blues hack for that is end of line resolves. So try when you're doing your next minor thing, throw in that little guy at the end.
Yeah.
And it kind of works a bit like a magic band-aid. The other thing too is try some of the other positions, right? So like, do you mind if I flip around in key or?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so if we're in E here, right, box 1 would. Right. But if we switch to minor from this perspective, because this is the major box 1, minor will be. This is another one that a lot of pro players are going to use a lot. And it's quite a fun place to be. And because the organization of the notes, you might find it's easier to construct licks there. So what I would also suggest is don't just get stuck in the box 1, box 2 area. The arrangement of those notes and the impulses your fingers have right now might be leading you in this path which is a little unsatisfactory or is a little hard for you to get used to. Whereas in other positions, you might more naturally come up with something.
Yeah.
Which is a bit more work. You do have to map out, I used to do it by envisaging the whole neck. Like I'd say that, I'm in the key of A minor and A major. So I'd then try to think of all my scales in A major. That works, but I found it a little cumbersome. An easier thing to do is learn your pentatonic scales off root notes. So like minor pentatonic, major. If I go here, minor. An interesting thing to note, minor was in this shape, right? Was big stretch, small stretch, small stretch. Well, off this root note, it's going to be the same as the start of my first finger. Right, and if it's going to be major, it's going to be small, big, big.
Yeah.
So kind of just getting familiar with how the shapes interact inside of one octave can be really, really helpful for helping you sight this stuff all over the neck in one go. You can get pretty far with just trying to keep split keys in your head and envisage the whole lot all in one go. But I never really found it was as speedy as just on one octave or just around here. Like, major from here, minor. And the more you can get used to the sounds of those things and be led by those sounds, the better. The easier it'll be to kind of transition between the two of them. And that's, the whole model of this year. You've got to know the sounds. You can't just throw your fingers at the neck and expect it always to come out good. And I think, to a certain extent, throwing your fingers at the neck is a stage that everyone goes through. But you also have to be kind of empathetic with it. Like if you didn't hear that line before you played it, it's a little bit of a crapshoot as to how it's going to come out.
Yeah.
And there will be times where it will just sound bad. Overall, you will progressively get better and better at making them fit and work better. But the best thing you could do is to make sure that, like, when you're hearing a chord, right? Like getting used to playing lines you actually hear, predict them with your mouth first. That was a splitting line as well. That was between major and minor.
Would you just be able to repeat that last bit again? Sorry.
So getting used to, say, singing your lines, right? Right, and that was a splitting, right? Because the way up is that same old, 6 arpeggio cliche from the piano, and then minor on the way down. Another thing that might help you like the minor a little bit is that every time in the center or the lower end of the neck you pass the minor, split the difference. You don't have to bend it all the way up to a major, but just a little bend on that minor third will tend to make it a little bit more appealing. Or slide immediately out of it. Because you might notice that the minor third is the blue note of major. Right? So another way might be where you started in that minor, and come back up to the major.
Yeah.
Those kind of things. Take a look at what you can do with it. Some of it for you is going to be getting over this hump of that it sounds off, which is not a bad thing. I'm always surprised more often when people don't think, some sounds sound strange, because there's always a thing in the back of my mind. It's like, are you really listening to it? Because if this is the first time you've heard this thing, it should sound kind of off, especially if you don't listen to a lot of these genres. So like I have the suspicion that when people don't immediately have some kind of gut reaction or don't find it difficult in places, that maybe they're still not really listening to what they're doing. And I certainly went through a few phases like that. I remember the first time I hit certain jazz chords, like flat ninths and things like that. Whilst thinking they were pretty, I also kind of thought they were pretty ugly. And I don't hear that anymore. That's not how I feel in any way anymore. But certain intervals and things would like really kind of get a fierce reaction from me, which it took a little while to kind of get over. But mostly through exposure and mostly through finding instances of them that I thought really worked well. And also focusing in on that whole tension release aspect, right? Like a lot of these things in isolation can sound quite nasty, but after you release the tension out of them, they sound pretty cool. So yeah, that's where I'd take that some of your blues stuff now. It was sounding pretty good though when you were just playing around. So like there's probably a certain amount of kind of getting in your own way about it.
Yeah, because I think another thing I really need to work on is like, especially what notes I'm specifically trying to hit or what sound I'm trying to get against the chord that's playing. And I know I sort of say that each week, but like knowing what specific like tones I want to hit against what chord that's being played. Like if it's the one chord, say hitting like a 7 or a 9 on top of it, and knowing what the ninth of that chord is without sort of, I know it takes a while, but like without sort of thinking about it and sort of knowing, but that's just like something that happens over time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still not necessarily great. There are players who can listen to someone play and they're like, oh, that's easy. That goes 9, 7, 6, 5, 3, 2, 2, 4, 4, 5. And I was like, that's not me. I still can't do that. I can see that working the way I'm working now, eventually I will get there. It's not even really a huge priority for me. One, I'm not a unique, so I don't have to, communicate that way with people. And very few people who are trained enough to really communicate that way. But what I can do is have an association between a note I hear in my head and the guitar. And that, for me, has always been more important. This idea that, like, I could work on the sounds that are on here. It becomes very difficult to then, like, tell someone else what that line is. I mean, it's not too difficult for me. I did do a lot of classical guitar. I can tell them the notes, all those fails. And I could definitely tell them once I look at my fingers and think about it, what interval it is against every chord. So it's like all of the knowledge is there, but it doesn't start there. It starts with the sound of what I want. So you don't necessarily have to get stressed out about being able to label it at pitch. The thing that I would work on, though, is getting melodies to kind of sit and announce the next section of it, which was kind of... cool, we're halfway. Awesome. Yeah, which is kind of what the lesson this week was going to kind of be about. It starts off primarily as a sight reading exercise. But what I was getting other people to do was use it to improvise. But the only time the improvisation counted is if the melodic line announced where the chord change was going to be. All right.
Yeah.
Do you have the sheet for this week?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't, because Outlook's having a total hissy fit. But so first thing that I point out to everyone is looking at the sheet. How much of it can you read? How much of it? What I want everyone to get in the habit of doing is before they read anything, see if you can use any tips or tricks to improve it. What's its key? Do you see shapes on the music that you recognize? So let's start with that. What's its key, and do you see any shapes that you recognize?
Yeah. So in the first bar, it's in C major. There's a first inversion, passing note, second inversion, passing note, root chord, and then it goes up to a C major in first inversion again.
Right. Now, just as a complete hint, I'm going to say all of this is going to be on the DGB strings. We're not going to cross strings. All right. The next thing is there anything else you notice about these passing notes? Do they connect to a certain note in the chord? What's going on with these? Is there anything that you notice about these passing notes?
They're sort of leading to the top note of the chord.
Right. So if we took the top note of the chord all the way through, what do we see?
It's just the scale.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All of these revelations now make this a hell of a lot easier to read. So the first thing you can see is that it's an inversion. So you said first inversion, which is correctly identified, right? Yeah, exactly what you're playing right now.
Yeah.
Okay. All of those things are things that you should go through with sheet music before you even play them. You know, if you see something in the key of B flat, you should be like, oh, well, I know all my modes. So here's B flat, and here are all the potential notes over the neck that B flat could be. And then from that point on, you don't even necessarily have to recognize the name. You only have to recognize the distance from the note you're on. Right? If it's the next note in the scale, well, it's the next note in the scale. So if I'm here, then it goes to here. Right? Depending on what scale you're on. All of those things are things I wish someone had drilled into me a lot when I started.
That was a sneeze.
I'm sorry, a sneeze or a macaw dying. So all of those things really, really help support the reading in a way that is kind of how I approach reading now compared to how I approach reading when I was taught it. The way I was taught it was you got to recognize all the notes all the time. And it's really not true. You don't have to recognize all the notes all the time. You just have to recognize the direction the note is heading in and by what interval.
Yeah.
And you can by doing that and using your scales as a guide tone, you can almost read blind without ever thinking about the note. That's not to say that you shouldn't be able to recognize what the note is. It's just that I found focusing in heavily, especially in some classical guitar music where there's like three different lines going in different directions and things like that focusing in on the note kind of added this layer of anxiety that meant I pretty much couldn't read. Couldn't read it fluently. Like I'd have to figure out each vertical moment of music. The other thing you will start to notice too is that the more you read music that has been written for your instrument, the more you are going to recognize particular shapes. The shape of this E chord on classical guitar music is really distinct. I've read it so many times in classical music that it's like, oh, I can tell you it's an E. I can tell you it's an E before I can tell you what any of the notes in the chord are. Like it's just a shape on the page. Oh, that's an E shape. And by extension, eventually you can kind of know that anything that has this intervallic pattern is one of these shape chords. So you can also go, oh, it's an E shape that starts on B, just by the spread of the notes and how they look.
Yeah.
So all of those tricks are things that you want to start thinking about as you read more and more music, depending on, of course, the level of sight reading you want to get to. Like I think everyone in the modern world should get an understanding of music to the point where they can read it. And if I threw at you sheet music and said, come back to me next month on this piece, you'd be able to do it. Sight reading is in itself a whole thing that you've got to dedicate a fair amount of your time into. And you have to have a fair amount of drive to get there. My problem is that I've never had that drive to really get that good a sight. I have never ever liked hearing someone sight read piece. I think their interpretations usually suck, and it's not their fault. It's off the top of their head.
Yeah.
it's just, it doesn't sound particularly emotive. I think, especially on the guitar, especially with music that is written for the guitar, a lot of expression is found with finding different paths through the music. So your first inclination on the first path you play, or even the fingerings they suggest, aren't necessarily going to be the best ones, or aren't necessarily going to be the best ones to express the music the way you want to. That's a great conversation to get into if you take up classical guitar, and I really recommend everyone does. As I've said to everyone in the past couple of weeks, like, classical guitar taught me a lot about melody and about expression. Each genre that I've kind of looked into, and I've looked into pretty much all of them over the years, has taught me something that the other genres, it was either very difficult to learn that message in, or it wasn't really focused on in that genre at all. And for classical music, it's definitely about tone production with your fingers and hands, not your pedals and picks, but the things you actually touch the guitar with, and how you touch the guitar and the way you touch the guitar. And the difference in orchestrating a melody in different ways. I can't tell you on the whole how lazy fingerings are on classical guitar sheet music. They will quite often just be things that are comfortable to play, but will totally disregard the tonal shifts you have, say, going from the G string to the B string.
Yeah.
And on a nylon string guitar, especially if it's strung with traditional nylon strings, which have a huge gauge difference between those two strings, the tonal shift is frankly jarring. So really digging into orchestration and how to interpret music when you're not allowed to change any of it, and still, without changing any of it, come up with your own interpretation, is a really fascinating process. So I would highly recommend, for your own pleasure and for your own education, at some point, take up classical guitar to a reasonable level where you get the technique down and where you start focusing in on the standard classical guitar repertoire music. For a lot of people who already play pop, that's not actually that hard.
Yeah.
Because you've already got a lot of the dexterity. What you need to do is just like sort out the finer points of touch and things like that. And then it's just diving into the music. And interesting things in classical music is, like, you can tell moments when the composer's being very playful. It's like, some lines are almost jokes in answers to other lines, and so whole interesting thing. So think about it. Think about having a look at it. Probably too much at the moment with uni and all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
But keep it in your back pocket, and like when you get some time open. I also can't tell you how enjoyable it is to play classical guitar music by heart. Don't believe in this kind of reading up a sheet thing. And for some reason, if I wake up early in the morning, I'll almost always play classical guitar. Granada by Isaac Albeniz is really common in that list, or Serenata Española. So definitely take a look at it. It definitely informed a lot. It fixed a lot of my blues playing and things, because it told me a lot about how melody should flow and how that gets expressed dynamically, and how that then leads into the next part of the song. Whereas just studying blues all the time, not all of the players even really know those messages, because you don't necessarily have to. The really good ones do. Their solos become a story, and the notes really feed into one another. But you can get surprisingly far in blues and rock without ever constructing a solo that actually makes musical sense.
Yeah.
It just kind of sounds cool. Okay, so play for me this exercise. I'm pretty sure you can do that first one.
One quick thing on the classical, how would you approach like starting that? Like,
okay, so I wouldn't bother with sheet music with classical. Going for someone who's already versed in pop guitar, I would say do it all in tab, because you have enough to care about with listening to multiple different versions of the music. So like, one thing a lot of classical players don't do enough of is listen to the pre-established repertoire and how famous people have interpreted these pieces before. But it's very much at home for you if you're a pop musician. So listening to those, grab yourself a tab and either research extensively classical technique, watch a lot of good players play. You'll be surprised that despite how institutionalized classical technique is, there's still a lot of variance between players. Or get yourself a couple of lessons with someone who can teach you classical technique. You will need a nylon string guitar.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a cheapie, it's kind of weird. Nylon string guitars don't have the same spread. I mean, they do have the same spread in quality. I can't tell you how much of an amazing experience it is to pick up like a $20,000 nylon string guitar. Those things are these beautiful light cannons that have this like such a range of tone color in them that if you come from a steel string background, it's kind of hard to believe that a guitar could have that many ranges of tone in them, because steel strings are the way they are produced and electric guitars are the way they are produced limits the physical tone differences you can put into the instrument. Good ones, the better. Like, I don't know if you ever picked up like a really good, expensive, like a Collins or something guitar,
Nope.
but you should do yourself a favor and get yourself down to like Gladesville Guitar Factory and like play some of the expensive acoustics. Like nothing cheaper than $4,000.
My because there was two music teachers at my high school, and then one, he was a sort of substitute teacher. And for my performance, I did Hunter's Moon by Andy McKee. It's sort of a percussive tapping one, and coincidentally, he was learning it at the same time, the substitute teacher, and he allowed me to use his guitar. I think it was $7 or $8,000 for the performance. And it was probably like this, like the sound. It just felt so full and sort of like it was just.
They're so alive.
Amazing,
Expensive acoustics really like they jump out, and there's a whole range of extra colors and things in there that just feel kind of dead and lifeless on the cheaper end.
Yeah.
But I would say that an $80 nylon string guitar sounds way better than an $100 steel string acoustic. You can still, like, a good player can pick up a cheap nylon string guitar and using good technique still make really beautiful sounding music. Enough that most people would be like, well, why would you buy a more expensive guitar? That old chestnut. Whereas it's not quite the same on a steel string acoustic. Like, you buy a cheap steel string acoustic, if you're lucky, it has one sound that's good.
Yeah.
Otherwise they can be quite shrill and kind of brassy. So yeah, to get started with classical, I would say don't worry about reading necessarily. It is a great avenue for you to get into reading, but it will slow down the pursuit of what I think are the main lessons, which are interpreting the music. So to start with, use tab, choose a song from classical repertoire you really love. Someone at your level, probably around grade 6 for the AMEB syllabus is probably a good, easy place to start. Once you hit grade 8, kind of grade 7, grade 8 in the AMEB syllabus, it's suddenly into like the real classical guitar repertoire.
Yeah.
And the pieces do have, one of the big criticisms of the AMEB syllabus is it has these weird like kind of jumps in difficulty between certain grades. There's a few of the grades are like, yeah, they're all the same, and then all of a sudden you hit this grade and you're like, whoa, shit. It's this big wall decline. One that pretty much everyone learns to start with is one called Romance. It might be called Spanish Romance, written by Anonymous. You've probably heard it. That guy. It's relatively easy because it's a repetitive picking pattern, and you're really focusing on a melody on the top string. It's also usually people's first introduction to a piece that sounds flashy and very classical, but isn't of the next difficulty level up.
Yeah.
One of my favorites, which is a grade 8 piece, is Capriccio Arabe, which I think is, for a lot of people, especially if you like the romantic classical music as opposed to, say, the Baroque classical music, Capriccio Arabe is like the first really serious piece of complicated classical music that features virtuosic runs and like interesting kind of counterpoint melody stuff. Like it's a real beefy piece that everybody plays. So like it's part of the absolute classical canon. You can look up almost any player online and listen to hundreds of different versions. What's really fascinating is how different all of those versions are in their own way, how different people's interpretation of the music is. I've got an interesting set of beef with that piece in the sense that I've done a lot of deep dives into it over the years. And one thing that I have noticed as an adult is that nobody plays it with the timings that are written on the music. especially in the runs. They do like this thing with the run where there's an opening run which is supposed to be 6-6-10 as a pattern, and they often do it as like 5-5-12 because it sits better under the fingers.
Yeah.
So one of my investigations as an adult has been like breaking through that and being like, no, what did Terega intend when he actually wrote this? Because it's quite a different piece when you start exploring that kind of articulation in it. You do, of course, have this kind of knee-jerk reaction from some people because it's been heard this way for like 100 years now, thanks largely to Segovia. So they're like, "Oh, you're doing something weird with this piece." And it's like, no, I'm playing it how it's written.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, that's what I do. Listen to the classical guitar repertoire. Anyone that stands out to you, grab a tab for it, and start with the one that you think is probably easiest. Some of the Villa-Lobos preludes, for instance, are not too demanding. They're kind of interesting and slightly avant-garde. Villa-Lobos is a Brazilian composer, I believe. So it's kind of a bit of a South American influence, almost a jazz influence in a way. But he usually has these kind of dramatic melodies that then lead into more dissonant middle sections and then back into the kind of dramatic melody. If you're really interested in getting started sometime, shoot me an email. I'll have a bunch of piece recommendations to look into a bunch of players. And then it's really going to be about focusing in on that technique.
Yeah.
Get used to what that's like, and then how to adjust that technique in order to get yourself lots of different colors. Yeah, cool. So can you play me that? Play me one of the exercises. So
No, that's no. I know that I did that last one on the GBE, not DGB, but
instead of coming up to
that would be
What I would do is for the exercise, keep it all in the DGB. All right. Can you read the first exercise under the book?
Sorry, what was that?
So can you switch to reading the first exercise in the four chord?
Yeah.
So you have got 1, 4, and 5 written above them?
Yeah.
This is unsurprisingly the chords that we're harmonizing the same scale with. It's the same scale.
Oops. No, that was a C.
So you want to be
Yeah. C, and then
root inversion F with a up one fret. Okay, so what this is obviously quite a fun little exercise to do with some grid versions and scales. What this exercise points out is outer voice movement and inner voice movement. Right, we have voice movement on the top. Voice movement in the middle. And for someone like you, who sometimes has problems with associating which thing's moving, everyone should be singing the line, but especially focusing on that middle voice. Because I would guess, with the way that your pitch seems to work, that when you hear this, the middle voice is the hardest for you to hear.
yeah.
And also lower voice. I can't make my voice do it.
Yeah, I just sort of hear. Let's see.
Right. So the exercise, you start doing it by singing them and playing each line across each chord. So this starts drilling home two things. One of which is focusing in on one of the lines of harmony and making that one move. Next is getting used to harmonizing that same scale with the kind of the most important harmonic chords in the key, 1, 4, and 5. Pretty much no matter what melody you write diatonically in scale, 1, 4, and 5 can do it. All right. You could even go so far as to say that the other chords are substitutes for those three. Like for instance, 2 and 4 in the key of C. So D minor and F. That's a 1 to 6 relationship. That's major, tonic, major, tonic. Relative, major, relative, minor. D minor is the relative minor of F. And just like with C and A minor, they're really closely linked to the point where sometimes in some music it's hard to tell them apart. So you could, for instance, say that, well, if I was harmonizing this note with the 4 chord, but I wanted it to be a little sadder, I'd use the 2 chord. So it's kind of like it's something you could switch in between, which is one of the reasons why it's really good to focus in on 1, 4, and 5. They're really the easy block harmony. You could also do this exercise harmonizing every note of the scale with one of those chords: C, D, E, F, G. I'm going to do G twice because it harmonizes with both 5 and 1 in this instance. F, G, F. It wasn't F. A, B, C, right? And C also harmonizes with 1 and 4, which is in itself a cool exercise. The next step in this whole reading / improvisation exercise is to see if you can improvise with these lines. So the top line is probably going to be the easiest one. The first thing to try out is, can you improvise on 1 chord? I think you and I have talked about this before, that I often find improvising on 1 chord really difficult because I find music is kind of a story between these harmonic points. Melody is a story between these harmonic points. So before we move on to that next point, have a quick crack at that. Come up with a little melody. Now, what we look for in melody is some kind of melodic mirroring or sequencing, right? Like we want to see ideas develop. So you probably want to come up with something. Right? You can hear that has an opening motif. Right? What was tying it together is this start. Da, be, da, answer. Da, be, da, answer. Right? That's an example. Obviously, there's a million different options of how you could do this. It could be something like that one changed chord. I'm trying to avoid that at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so have a quick go. Fine example, right? Again, the more that you can, now, because it's kind of more predictably on 1 string too, I think it's a little easier to hear where you want to go.
Yeah.
And the more you can kind of hum that tune in your head as you're playing. If you're home, if you're home alone and you don't mind singing out loud, a great option is to play the chord and sing the melody out loud before you try playing.
Yeah.
So the next step on this, obviously, then we should try it in the middle voices and the low voices, right? And the only reason I'm doing the top is because I think we've got 15 minutes. No, we have 3 minutes. And what you want to do is figure out how all of these things feel different, figure out what it's like to improvise on the middle string and on the lower voice too. But the real thing that you've got to kind of work on is getting your melody to announce where the chord change is going to happen. All right, so something like you can hear how that transition to 4 chord, it made total sense. because the way I resolved into that F note, and the whole melody seemed to build up to that. It used a little bit of mirroring, and then it moved into that chord. That's what then made that harmonic change sound good. And this is the real challenge in improvising. No matter what style you're doing, it's that, generally speaking, melodies tell us what the harmony is going to do. And it's probably a huge thing that's lacking for any time when you're playing and you're like, I just don't feel like it's that great.
Yeah.
See, we're on a bit of time pressure, but like see what you can do with it. Have a quick crack at see if you can announce the 4-chord change, for instance. It might be the 5 that you hear, so I don't want to like put a limit on it. But,
So doing the 1 and changing to the 4, or just the 4?
no, doing the 1 and changing to either the 4 or the 5,
Okay.
depending on how the melody goes, right?
Yeah.
See, if you had it come up back to the D, that would have been a beautiful.
Yeah.
You had sort of like. Right, like you had to just come back up to that G. That would have been so the D note would have been perfect line change. The melody felt like it was having that shape. Have another step. Yeah.
No, I feel like I was sort of trying to end it on the C.
Like, what was really interesting there is that early on, it almost felt like it was a 4 change. You kept it on 1, and it didn't feel wrong. What felt wrong was that you felt a pressure in you to change chords.
Yeah, I felt like when I stopped, like, I feel like when I got to there, I feel like I had to go to the C. Yeah.
And that's fine too. Okay, so the other thing I've been telling everyone is one habit we can get into from pop music is that you have to change after a certain number of bars. Don't put that pressure on yourself. If that melody is still speaking C, don't change. The point is that you've got to develop an understanding of when it was supposed to change. Eventually, you can then make that time period shorter and you could make it fit into a progression. But that's not the goal. I think that was actually a really cool melody that was just all on 1. And it was only until that very end where you're kind of getting anxious. It's like, I haven't changed chords yet.
Yeah.
But like I was saying earlier, it's really hard to put a melody all on 1. I find I run out of steam. I find like it's a little boring. And then I really want, I have to find a way of moving out of this because I'm getting bored, so everyone else must be. But that wasn't. That was working perfectly fine. Have another quick go. As hey, perfect. Yeah, like, that worked really well, right? Because all of those changes worked in at very logical points in that melody.
Yeah.
This is kind of what I mean by focusing in on the result, focusing in on how that melody and the harmony relate. The more of that you do, the easier it is for you to do it in a structure where you've got to change at the end of 4 beats. You've only got 4 beats on this chord. And I think a lot of the time what we do is, as a beginner, it's almost like we feel like the time on the chord is infinite and we're not really constructing our line thinking of where we have to go. More than that, we're not even really sure how to structure a line on how to go somewhere. So the more of this kind of exercise you do, just in the middle and lower voicings too, don't neglect them. The more you kind of get this understanding of, oh, when I do this kind of shape, that's how I announce a chord change. You know, when I hover around these 2 notes and change to this one, that's how I announce a chord shape. And that's what you then need to bring back into more structured play.
Yeah.
You know, this is kind of a bit classical in a sense because we're not too fussed about a structure as much. We're just focusing in on writing a melody out and harmonizing that melody. It's also kind of like a fun exercise of kind of like playing rhythm and lead at the same time that we don't normally focus on. All right. So add it to your kind of your improv repertoire as something to do. Now you can also do all of this stylistically. You could do this in a blues, or make it jazzy or whatever by adding different variations to it. Add your blue note, make it all dominant seventh instead of making it just plain major or minor.
Yeah.
But don't even shoot for that immediately.
Yeah.
The basics of the exercise is melodic shape, using some of our concept of melody. Are we using melodic mirroring? Are we using call and response? What are the things that make something sound like a melody instead of playing a scale or instead of just shooting for a note? You didn't display it at all, but one of the problems that we did see with some other people was that it's like they have a timer in their head that's like, it's been 2 bars, so I'm playing a melody. Damn it, I just made that one work. It's like they get to a certain point, right? That was a better example, where it's just like, oh, I've got to change chords, and they just leap to that next chord.
Yeah.
And melodically, it didn't make any sense. It still sounded okay because it's following a set pattern that we're all familiar with, which means that because music is a prediction game, like we all go, yep, that still sounds a bit like music. But that's what you want to avoid. You don't want to go leaping towards the next chord change. You want your melody to announce it and kind of blend into it naturally. Like I said, not a problem you seem to have had, but you might have it when you're practicing tomorrow or 2 weeks, right? So it's something to keep in mind. Alrighty, I'm going to have to wrap this up because I'm 4 minutes late for the next class.
That's all good.
I'm going to send out an email about exam with what's going to be in the exam. It's going to be the stuff we have talked about in these 5 lessons. If you want any extra help or you want to meet up and have a chat about it, just send me an email or something. We could book in a time to have another like half-hour video chat or whatever.
Yeah.
Anything you feel insecure on. I really, considering you're one of the people that's been actually kind of looking at it and doing some of the work, I really don't think you're going to have a lot of problems. The one thing that you probably will need to revise is the extensions.
Yeah.
As an idea of that, there will be questions on some of the extensions. Again, I'm going to send out a bigger email, and you get to book a time in the couple of weeks where exams are going on. Awesome, man. Really great to see you.
Thank you too. Yeah, I'll see you next time. Have a good week.
You too, man.